welcome back to Ruben Uncut. Today, I have a guest. Yeah, I know it's been a while since I had an honest to goodness guest, but today I'm being joined by. I'm not sure if I've ever tried to say your last name before.
Legally, it's Wesley. The family last name is Weslowski.
Weslowski. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I'm sure you've known plenty of Poles, so.
No, yes.
I mean, Thomas is.
Oh yeah, Thomas is a Polak.
Oh, racial slur.
Is that a slur? I didn't know that was a slur.
Yeah, technically, it basically is.
Okay, good to know. I've also heard that hockey is a Polish slur, but I think it's more associated with white people in general now.
Yeah. Have you ever watched like All in the Family, and Archie would always say Polak, and you ever think like maybe he's saying that in a derogatory term?
You know what? I assume that he's saying everything derogatorily.
Yeah, he's basically a wasp.
Yeah, no, I mean that was the whole idea of the show is, hey, let's get this really uptight racist dude, and we're gonna force him to learn all these liberal lessons.
Yeah.
But anyways, it's Vaughn, right?
Yes,
Vaughn. Yes.
And Ruben Ryan.
Yes, that is.
Are you wasp?
No, actually, I'm not a wasp.
You're not British at all. No British heritage.
I probably have some Brittany in me somewhere, but I am primarily Scotch Irish, with a little bit of Gaelic in there. So primarily people that Anglo-Saxons colonized.
Basically.
Basically.
Yeah. You have the poor neighbors there, the Welsh, Scots,
Irish.
I'm
Welsh. I am also Welsh. I also have Welsh in me. Very Celtic family.
That sure is. And then there's the Brits who, like, we want to colonize you all.
Yes. And I could talk forever about all that shit.
Yeah.
But you wanted to talk to me, and for anyone who's not familiar with Vaughn, he is a local comedian here in Northeast Ohio. Very funny guy. You do like a Stephen Wright type of thing.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
I really like his stuff.
Oh yeah, no, Stephen Wright's hilarious.
I love his stuff. Because of my influences, him, him, Mitch Hedberg, Emo Phillips. I would say those are the trio of like one-liner comedians.
Oh yeah.
And then another big influence is Louis C.K., which I would say is not as awkward as mentioning him as influence compared to Bill Cosby.
Which is interesting, because Bill Cosby's comedy very clean.
Yeah, very clean, but
terrible behavior behind the scenes, but very clean comedy.
Yeah, but with Louis, it's like, well, at least she apologized, because like he was like one of the very few people, like a day after that came out, like he issued an apology, and it's like nobody else ever did that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of other things that went into it. I used to be a huge Louis C.K. fan also. Although I won't lie, I'm not a big a fan of some of his newer material, just because I feel like he's gone in a weird direction with some of it. But very talented man overall.
Oh yeah, very talented.
And it's a spectrum of terrible male behavior. He's nowhere near Harvey Weinstein.
He's on the low end.
The lower end.
Which,
as far as I can tell, from the people who, Dan Harmon is like the lowest end possible.
Yeah.
Because he was the only person to out himself, and even when he did out himself, it was like, okay, well that's shitty, but you didn't sexually harass anyone, so good for you, Dan Harmon, I guess.
Out of all the comedians that ever did like a Cosby bit, I would say Norm Macdonald's is the best. That was just fucking hilarious.
Yeah, Norm Macdonald, very talented man as well.
Oh yeah. He's one like that, does not give a fuck, and he would do whatever he thinks is funny. His OJ bits were just hilarious.
Mm-hmm. It's Norm Macdonald's interesting because Norm Macdonald really covers the spectrum of comedy too.
Yeah.
Like I mean, he is more of a punchline guy.
Oh yeah.
But specifically speaking, he, like, you could see a Norm Macdonald thing and it could be pretty blue, or you could see a Norm Macdonald thing and it wouldn't be blue at all.
Oh yeah, he can be very clean and he can be very dirty or just very dark. It depends upon what he wants to do.
Which is what makes him very impressive, really.
Yeah. And because I remember I was showing something to my mom, and she, it was like pretty clean from him.
Yeah.
And then he ends up like starts swearing and everything. And this another clip because it was about because I showed my parents of compilation of him talking about Hitler, and then towards the end he started like swearing and all that kind of shit, and she just didn't,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
it took her by surprise. Like, oh, I didn't expect him to swear and be vulgar. I'm like, he can be pretty vulgar if he wants to. Like, I think I listened to the one he was on with Mark Maron, and he was pretty vulgar on that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, sometimes he's not always vulgar, but it's just whenever he feels like it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I feel like that instinct lies in us all somewhere. Uh, I was a huge Mitch Hedberg guy.
Oh yeah,
Especially in my college years. I was huge into his work. Tragically, I never heard any of his content I hate that I call it content reflexively. But I never really heard any of his material until I was about that age, which was tragically after he had passed away.
yeah.
Um,
He has some post-hominous stuff that came out
yeah,
after.
yeah,
Yeah, I think the last thing was Do You Believe in Gosh, which I have that on my phone on
that's
iTunes.
a good one.
Yeah, it really
I've heard
is.
that one. I just there's a part of me that is going to say that I've heard of all of Mitch Hedberg's albums, but there's also a part of me that's like secretly like, I hope there's one I haven't.
Oh yeah. It's like the Nirvana's fourth album, their mysterious fourth album.
I would like that for Mitch Hedberg too, please.
Yeah.
But and in fact, and actually in college, people, I don't know, like I don't know what's wrong with my voice. But in college, like the more Mitch Hedberg I listened to, the more I like started to sound like Mitch Hedberg, and it was the point where people were calling me on it, and I was like, oh, okay. I have a very elasticy voice. It also sponges, which actually was kind of a problem when I used to sell insurance over the phone, because like sometimes I would just suddenly be talking Southern to people all the time, and half the time they'd be Southern, and it'd be like, well, I can't stop in the middle of this call.
Yeah, basically.
I will lose this sale. But I caught myself almost picking up on a woman's like Eastern European accent one time, and I was like, I can't let that happen.
Yeah.
This conversation will get ugly if she suddenly starts thinking that I'm just making fun of her accent.
Yeah, it gets very dicey with that because most people in America don't know this, but over in Europe, there's like a great divide between Western and Eastern Europeans, particularly of how Western Europeans view Eastern Europeans, which is basically how Americans view Mexico and everyone else below, just as criminals and hookers and like they're going to steal our jobs and all that.
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be a lot more of that going on right now with all the Ukrainian refugees and people fleeing Ukraine.
Yeah.
Although, in fairness, depending on how the war turns out, a bunch of those people will just go back to Ukraine in the end.
Yeah, and
which is the way wars normally go.
Yeah, and Russia's doing very badly. It's so bad.
I hope that continues, which actually brings us vaguely full circle here, because one of the things, because when you messaged me, one of the things you wanted to talk about was what was it? Was it alt-right or right-wing extremism, generally speaking?
I mean, you can title this as what I said to you if you want. It's up to you. It's your podcast. But I said alt-right, Tankies, and Authoritarians.
Okay. Yeah. No.
Which I think is all too relevant now.
Yeah. No. I'll just say I think I get the impression that we are going to generally, by and large, agree on these. These things. My big thing with authoritarianism, though, is that a major thing that people misunderstand about authoritarianism is that authoritarianism is not in and of itself an ideology. It's merely how you enact your ideology itself. So any ideology or any type of governmental or power structure can be authoritarian.
Oh, yeah.
And that's a big thing that I don't think some people really understand. Is that like anything can be authoritarian. That's why you always got to be like looking out for it.
Yeah, it can be, either right wing, left wing, center. Like I know one person I saw maybe on Reddit or something, they said that Idi Amin was like really the perfect example of like a centrist authoritarian. Because he pretty much had like no political allegiance to either like any fringe on either side.
Same for Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein actually like enforced a he had to keep peace between multiple Muslim people. So
Yeah.
he specifically was like, no, we're going to be a secular society that just happens to be primarily Muslim. And sometimes he was a piece of shit about it.
Yeah, Saddam, I would consider him to be authoritarian left because Baathism,
Oh, okay. Okay. I can see what you're saying there
because
about Baptism. But that in, I want to, okay, wait, hold on. I want to address this real quick. So, like, the origins of the word right and left refer to something from early French
mm,
democracy, and essentially, right wing was the sat on the side of the at the time whoever the main central figure was, the executive branch. The people who sat on the right of him would be people who believed that they should try and skew as much towards their prior hierarchy system as much as they could. And on the left, you had people who wanted to move away from the hierarchy system.
mm,
Um, so the term, so technically, on the spectrum of politics, the furthest you can go left is anarchism because it's the complete dissolution of all hierarchical
mm,
systems. And the furthest you can go to the right on the other end would be like a central power figure dictatorship or like a monarchy.
mm,
So those are technically what those things mean. That being said, plenty of people who have claimed to be on this left wing side, which would normally mean no hierarchy or limited hierarchy, or just like, depending on where you are on the spectrum, smaller hierarchy. Um, these people, there are many incidents where these people did not dissolve their hierarchy or
mm.
would continue to enforce their hierarchy, or great examples, of course, being people like Stalin. Actually, most countries that have attempted or claimed to be communist, which has so many problems with the concept of these countries being communist to begin with. But the point is that on a certain philosophical or ideological level, technically a true left-wing system could never technically be authoritarian. However, the reality is that human beings are complex,
Yeah.
contradictory creatures,
Mm-hmm.
and that many people who hold left-wing beliefs will still use authoritarian tactics to create systems that are generally oppressive, even though they are enforcing concepts that are contradictory to their own internal logic.
And the French Revolution is the beginning of that because
Yeah.
I like to call the French Revolution the good, the bad, and the ugly because there were times in which it got very ugly, which I'm sure we'll eventually get to that. But
which is why there's like stuff like the Scarlet Pimpernel,
yeah.
which is basically reverse Robin Hood.
Mm.
Which is basically a guy who's like, I'm going to save all the rich people from the proletariat murdering them in France. And that's essentially what it is.
But it tends to be that Robin Hood came from a wealthy family.
That is actually also very interestingly true.
Yeah, because as you can tell with a lot of communist figures, a lot of the most influential ones came from wealthy families. The two founders, Marx and Engels, came from wealthy families.
Although in fairness, Marx himself ended up broke.
Yeah, but you know, he was good friends with Engels, and Engels just bailed him out.
This is true.
And Lenin came from nobility, came from a wealthy family. Trotsky did as well, but Trotsky for the longest time was not a communist until 1917. A lot of people don't know that. Stalin was a communist longer than him. Oh. Trotsky was the first head of the Soviet secret police. Felix Dzerzhinsky was head of he was from Polish nobility, and then his successor. Mao Zedong was came from a very wealthy family. His father was originally came from poverty, and then his father ended up building up and became the wealthiest farmer in the whole province. Pol Pot came from a wealthy family.
Pol Pot was wild,
The
man.
Hitler of communism, I like to call him.
Pol Pot was insane.
Oh, he was.
Like, what he didn't even make sense. And like, so like, actually, a lot of people who were part of these specific communist revolutions were kind of insane.
Oh, yeah.
Like, for instance, a thing a lot of people don't know is that part of what caused the famine in Russia was that the head of agriculture didn't know shit about agriculture. He like actually believed he had an idea for planting plants, which was to plant them in like piles, to take seeds and plant them in piles, because his theory was that the seeds, like the workers, would be stronger together, but not that's a weird analogy
Yeah.
and not how plants work. And he even took pictures of people standing on piles of seeds, which ruins a lot of seeds, by the way,
Mm.
to say how strong our seeds is. So like, yeah. And but the thing is, another one of the reasons that a lot of communism is a disaster is because communism is actually the final form of something that's supposed to take place over like an extended period of time economically. And the thing is also is that communism and capitalism are all systems that are designed to be part of industrialization.
Mm.
And most countries that have attempted communism skip industrialization
Mm.
or skip to industrialization. Like Pol Pot's a great example. He had an agrarian society.
Mm.
In fact, he never even successfully fully industrialized them to the same extent that the Soviet Union or any of the other communist countries did. So he essentially was like, okay, how will we do this? I know all the rich poor people are rich now, and all the rich people got to go work on the farms.
Mm.
And it's like, that's just bad. That's just nonsense, Pol Pot. That's not, you're not thinking this through.
And then the last two major figures that came from wealthy families is Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. Matter of fact, when Fidel Castro died, it's estimated that he was worth $900 million and owned 20 something mansions, which explains why Cuba is not very economically well. I mean, people like to blame the embargo, but really,
I mean, the embargo cut off their connection to oil, though. And
yeah,
they had to learn how to do all of their agrarian work without synthetic pesticides or fertilizer. That's the
yeah,
one I'm looking. So I mean, there is some truth to the embargo statement, but they did have other problems. Although it's
yeah,
worth noting that relative to communist countries,
yeah,
Cuba is relatively successful compared to almost all of them. Now, to be
yeah,
fair, that's a relative measure of success.
yeah. They're still a police state,
I mean, yeah.
and
In fairness, America also technically police statey, or at least the most incarcerated.
yeah, and also like most communist regimes, like ironically, are pretty much state capitalist.
Yeah, no, I mean that's a big thing.
Which is exactly what like a lot of fascist regimes are as well.
Mm-hmm.
They're state capitalists, in which the party pretty much owns, like pretty much has full control of the
Mm-hmm.
economy.
Looking at you, China and Russia. Looking at you.
Yeah, and I mean,
Although Russia's also just pretty much just doing capitalism at this point.
yeah.
They've privatized so much of the things that used to be the state in that country.
Well, I think what went wrong with Russia was that when the Soviet Union ended, unlike doing what Poland or Czechoslovakia did, which was elect a leader that was not a member of the previous party at all, which is what Poland and Czechoslovakia did, because Lech Volsha, I believe how you say his name, and Václav Havel of Czechoslovakia, and the first ones of Poland, they were not members of the Communist Party at all. They were a member of the anti-establishment of the opposition. And allowing people like that to gain power would be a lot better than having people who are like, well, I'm changing my ways. I'm no longer a communist. I'm a liberal or a social democrat or whatever. They were not very sincere about it, because it turns out that all these communist parties were corrupt as fuck. And very and other than being very authoritarian, they're very corrupt. I mean, all three leaders of the Russian Federation were former members of the Communist Party: Putin, Yeltsin, and Medvedev.
Now, in fairness, that's because previously the way a lot of communist governments at this point in time, almost everything you attach the word communist to is an oxymoron if you've ever actually read Marx. But that's besides the point. But the former, they only had a one party system, and this is true for China as well.
And that creates stagnation.
I mean,
extreme stagnation, because when you don't have any pushback, then there's a level.
Theoretically, there should always be pushback.
Yeah.
Theoretically, there should always be pushback, regardless of what system you have. But if your system runs on fear, then that's going to be a problem.
Oh yeah. And like cult of personality.
Oh yeah, which is a big problem nowadays.
Yeah, And
That's
which is one thing that fascism and communism have in common is that they both essentially want to recreate the very idea of what a human being is, and have a what they consider a perfect human being, whether it be racial or whatever.
mhm,
With the communist movement, it ended up becoming different because, I mean, originally it was internationalist, but as the communist movement started continuing, and particularly starting with Lenin, and then Stalin fully went
mhm,
on board with it, they started incorporating nationalism
yeah.
within the communist movements, and then that ends up, then we get Nesbols, which
Yeah.
are way more
Oh
batshit
my god.
crazy than just old ethno-nationalist
Yeah.
communists.
So I will say this. I describe myself as a democratic socialist, not a social democratic socialist, which are different things for anyone listening. But I anyone who truly has red marks or cares about communism or socialism or democratic socialism, do not give your energy to tankies.
Hmm.
Do not listen to tankies. Tankies are nonsense.
Yeah,
They
they're
support a nonsense ideology. Their version of communism is inherently like, no, it's communist, but it sounds like fascism, guys. Look at what we're doing. It's nonsense. And Nazbols, for those who don't know what that means, that is essentially like they're they're communists who are literally Nazis.
Yeah, it's basically a mixture of communism
Mhm.
with nationalistic Nazism. And
Yes.
even their flag, basically, they have like a black
Hmm.
hammer and sickle, which is like a black swastika. And then the outside is basically the coloring and design of the Nazi flag. And they're like straight up, like,
Hmm.
um, they're red fascist. I mean, you can
Yes.
basically apply that term to
Yes.
tankies and other communists as well. I mean, to me, like, if you're a communist post, like, uh, Velvet Revolution of '89, then you're just a reactionary. You're not revolutionary anymore. Like when your revolution constantly fails, it's like, all right, this is not going to happen. You're just a reactionary now. Which there's a funny post because I'm on Twitter, and particularly I follow NATO Twitter, which is NATO is basically a play on a NATO, in which it's North Atlantic
Okay.
Fellas organization, which the fella being a dog, which I forget the type of
Is
Shiba dog or something like that.
okay.
That's usually the mascot.
Okay. It's
And
been a while since I've been on Twitter in any legitimate fashion. Is this what type of is this pro or anti-native?
this is pro NATO, and they're
Okay.
pro Ukraine, pro
Okay.
liberal democracy,
Mhm.
anti fascism, anti communism, anti authoritarianism movements. And there's one guy I follow. He's Belarusian,
Mhm.
and his mom immigrated here, and he's very pro Ukraine. He's not
Okay.
pro Russia at all. Though he's mentioned that his mom follows all Fox News kind of stuff and whatnot. But he's actually pretty level headed, and I
Okay.
like him. And he posted a cartoon in which I don't know who made it, but it was pretty funny. In which it had a pretty much a blonde, muscular communist being dragged, and he's crying by AOC and Bernie Sanders to a towards a side of a like in the grass, because there's a sign that says 21st century relevance, and they're dragging him towards that way. Like, get out of the 20th century. It's like the Cold War is done.
Yeah.
You're just a reactionary at this point.
I mean, in fairness, I will say that so I pay more attention to a lot of socialists and communists than I would assume that you would. Um but like I will say from my experience, tanky these they're the tanky people seem like they are a minority in America, so to speak. That being said, I'm familiar with some of them, such as Caleb Maupin, who is disgusting, and Yankee Tanky, who is a lunatic.
And
Uh,
there's some other ones as well. There's some people that just completely fell off. Jimmy Dore.
oh, is Jimmy Dore? Is he a Tanky?
Oh yeah.
I just I do not actually know Jimmy Dore's full like belief system.
He. Oh yeah, he's full on pro
I
Russia, like
oh
conspiracy
shit.
theorist.
Hold
Uh,
on, hold on though. That doesn't necessarily mean he's a Tanky,
oh,
because Christian. What I'm getting at is I don't know what his full political beliefs are, but because it's worth noting that Christian nationalists have also been being very pro Russia as well, and I wouldn't call them Tankies.
yeah, it's usually if you have like whole like left leaning
Hmm.
beliefs is if you're a tanky,
Hmm.
and like yeah, Jimmy Dore, Glenn Greenwald, who like both of them really fell off. Like
Oh yeah.
Glenn Greenwald used to be like very sensible, and he just fell off badly.
Oh yeah.
You have those two, and then you have a guy. CNN just released an article about him. He used to be a Bernie bro, and then he basically fell off badly.
Oh boy. What's
Jackson Hinkle,
Oh, Jackson Hinkle. I have heard of Jackson
MAGA
Hinkle.
communism, which is
Oh,
like
right. He's that guy.
yeah,
Oh my God,
it's
he's that guy.
basically his take on Nesbol, but in an American sense.
I have heard of MAGA. I have heard of MAGA communists.
Yeah,
Oh my God.
Brianna Joy Gray, who used to be Bernie Sanders' press secretary, she's a
Oh right,
tanky.
she's insane now
Oh
too.
yeah, I mean, she should have gotten fired for this before, but eventually the nail on the coffin was that there was a victim of one of the Israeli women who her sister was a victim of the massacre that Hamas
Yeah,
did.
October 7th.
That they kidnapped and whatnot. She was one of the people that got kidnapped, and Brianna Joy Gray was known to be kind of
Hmm.
very insensitive when it came down to that topic, and so she ended up rolling her eyes when this woman said, like, "I hope you believe in the victims that come up forward and say that." And she rolled her eyes.
Mm.
Though I think she should have gotten fired when she was talking to this one guy about Russia, and he said that Russia is kidnapping Ukrainian children, and she rolled her eyes at that. I think she should have gotten fired then.
Oh my
And
God.
she even bragged on Twitter, she's like, "I'll never get fired." And
Where does she work now? What is she? What is?
I know she went on Candace Owens' podcast.
Of course she did.
Oh yeah,
Of
yeah,
course she did.
yeah. Essentially, ever
Oh my God.
since
To go from Bernie Sanders to Candace Owens, that would give most people whiplash.
well, I like to say that really the tanky because I mean you could say the tankies really it came around in 2016 when people
Hmm.
started being alienated by mainstream left leaning politics in America. But I would say it really kicked off when Russia invaded Ukraine. That's when I
Yeah,
saw it really
which
kicked
is
off.
probably because Russia's giving people money.
Yeah, well, that as well. We look at you, Glenn Greenwald.
Yeah, and the whole
Um,
thing that came out with the it's technically not Tankies, but the whole thing that came out with the Tenant
oh
Network
yeah,
and Tim Pool and Dave Rubin and
yeah. Lauren Southern, all
Lauren
those
Southern. Yeah.
people. Yeah. Essentially, once Russia invaded Ukraine, you had people on the far right and far left, then for the first time since the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, shake hands with each other and like, we got this. We're going to own these. We're going to own the libs by allowing Russia to annex and commit genocide against Ukraine.
Yeah, it. Yeah, I
And that's a funny thing because whenever you bring up the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, that when the Soviet Union collaborated with the Nazis, people will get upset and they'll come on the defense of the Soviet Union, and they're oh, the Soviet Union beat the Nazis. They lost the most during World War II. I'm
yeah,
like,
but they
well,
also really wanted Poland too, you guys.
yeah, and they beforehand during the Great Purge, they committed ethnic cleansing and
Yeah.
genocide against the Polish minority, which is known
Hmm.
as the Polish operation. Stalin was despite being ethnically Georgian, Stalin was an outright Russian nationalist.
Hmm.
He believed that Russians were the first among equals, and so on forth. I mean, you could say Russian nationalism was really there since the beginning, even when Lenin was around, because in March 8th, 1918, he renamed the party the Russian Communist Party.
Hmm.
And then during the Civil War, they end up doing a reorganization of an old painting of Saint George, who was riding a horse and slaying the dragon. Well, and Saint George, if anybody doesn't know, he's Roman, but he's considered a patron saint in Russia. So he's part of like Russian culture and whatnot. And they end up doing a communist co-op with it, in which they replaced Saint George's face with Trotsky's face. And the dragon was supposed to be the dragon of counter-revolution that he was slaying. And then to top it all off, Lenin initially didn't want to come off as a Russian chauvinist. So he promised ethnic minorities within Russia that they would gain independence. But there's a twist that he was hoping that they would rejoin the Soviet Union.
Mhm.
When it became very apparent during the Civil War that none of them wanted to rejoin the Soviet Union, he's like, well, I didn't want to be a Russian chauvinist, but you made me no choice.
So he's basically like that controlling parent who like gives their kid two options. One, and the kid, when the kid chooses the wrong option, they're like, nope, nope, you got to do the other one.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Okay,
And
that's the kind of bitch you are, man.
so if anybody knows, Lenin was a piece of shit. He was an overall piece of shit. He was not as he wasn't a psychopathic sadist like Stalin was, but he was a sociopathic piece of shit that really did not care of how many people he had killed or tortured or thrown in prison or what. Anything. The only thing that mattered was a revolution, and he was pretty much just a Russian Robespierre. Which, matter of fact, he really loved Robespierre, and they even enacted a statue of him in 1918.
I don't think I know Robespierre.
Quick edit here. So what is happening at this part in the podcast is that Vaughn has a problem where he mispronounces Robespierre. I'm saying it wrong too. Robespierre. I do know who Robespierre is. We had this conversation after the podcast where he's like, I'm really surprised you don't know who Robespierre is. And I was like, do you mean Robespierre? And he's like, oh, yeah, I have trouble pronouncing his name. I mispronounce it a lot. And I was like, oh, okay. So what's happening is that he's talking about Robespierre, who is a very famous person from the French Revolution. We do both know who he is. It's just a language barrier, probably caused by someone doing a lot of reading on a topic. But anyways, that's just know when he says Robespierre, we're talking about Robespierre, and that we all know who that is.
I'll get to
is it a lot? Is it a lot? Is Robespierre a lot?
He's very notorious. So okay. I'll let me because I was planning on saying this before, but I'll retract about Robespierre and get right back to him because this will lead right back into him.
Okay.
But I have my two big criticisms of communism.
Okay.
And these are the biggest, and they also coincide with each other. The first one will lead into the second one. Is that my biggest issue of communism? Number one is that it completely rejects the idea that human beings have an inner nature, and instead believes that human beings were historical products that were simply products of their environments. And the problem with that idea is that if human beings are only that and did not have a human inner nature, then therefore they want to have an inner sense of freedom. And if they don't have an inner sense of freedom, and essentially is that if they don't have like a human nature, which therefore would have an inner sense of freedom, then there is no barrier of how you can mold them. Basically, you can do whatever that you want with them. Essentially, if they don't have an inner sense of nature.
And is this a Robespierre idea?
Nope. This is well, I'll get back to it because it does have a lineage to it, and that leads into my second criticism. That kind of idea leads into is that basically humans also become like clay. Essentially, and instead of viewing them as having an inner nature, having an inner sense of freedom, you view them as clay, in which you can mold them however you want them to be. You can murder them, torture them, terrorize them. It essentially dehumanizes them completely, and that leads into an idea that was not originally in the Communist Manifesto. It was something that
I was going to say I do not remember this part of the Communist Manifesto.
Well, it's in line with historical materialism. It's more in line with Marx's idea of that. Essentially, that this idea, and then it leads into an idea that was not originally a part of the Communist Manifesto. Was something that Marx and Engels' mutual friend, I can't think of his name right now, he came up with this, and essentially Marx and Engels liked so much that they adopted it, which is something that's very well known in communism, which is was published in 1853, and the pamphlet is called The Dictatorship of the Proletariat.
I have heard the dictatorship proletariat.
So the idea for that is that the revolutionaries would organize together and overthrow the bourgeoisie, and then they would then create a dictatorship of the proletariat, which would lead into eventual their stateless, moneyless.
Normally, when people are talking about dictatorship of the proletariat, they're referring to the concept that individuals would then be the essentially control society instead of
Well, that's how
power structure.
That's how it's usually framed. But if you actually look into this document and see the guy's influence, the guy that came up with it, his influences to this idea, because I know one of Marx's biggest rivals, Bakunin, who was a very big anarchist. This completely turned him off. He's like, no, the communist leadership is going to become the dictatorship of proletariat. It's going to become a dictatorship over the proletariat.
Yeah.
And if you go into the document, it's very telling. That's basically what their friend was going for. And
do you remember the name of their friend by any chance? Or?
Can't think of his name right now. I will Google it. After this, I'll Google it and then I'll give it the name.
Okay.
But essentially, the guy's influences for the transitionary period, known as the dictatorship of the proletariat, came from two sources. What Oliver Cromwell did in England, and what the Committee of Public Safety did in the French Revolution.
Okay.
So if anybody that doesn't know who Oliver Cromwell did, well, essentially, there was 3 civil wars in England called English Civil Wars. Cromwell was a military officer, British military officer within this conflict. In the first half, things will definitely change here soon. But essentially, he was on the side of the Parliament against King Charles I, who was just completely corrupt and completely incompetent and whatnot. Well, after the Second English Civil War ended, Cromwell, with the backing of the military, overthrew King Charles I, and then later used the military to enforce his rule, essentially making him a military dictator. And though he didn't call himself that, his term was Lord Protectorate.
Okay.
Which is essentially just a military dictator. And he also dissolved Parliament as well. He later dissolved the Parliament. Parliament had their own issues, and he probably just used that against them. He's like, oh, you guys can't trust them, so I'll just dissolve you, even though beforehand, King Charles I dissolved Parliament a lot. He did that quite a lot, and then Cromwell ended up later doing that. And then if all of this was not bad enough, before he would do this, little context, Ireland was a colony of Britain at the time.
Okay.
Well, in the beginning of the English Civil War, when everything was going on, the Irish basically just broke away from the British.
Good for them.
Well, Cromwell, he wanted that back.
Okay, Cromwell is who I thought he was.
And he basically did a brutal reconquest of Ireland.
Okay.
Which has made him the most hated figure in Ireland to this day.
And so the author of this document referenced being inspired by Cromwell?
Yes, and what he did, which was pretty much not everyone's going to basically be own everything in it. No, it was a singular individual. And then so we get that. Then we get something in worse, which we get the Committee of Public Safety.
Okay.
Which
this I'm not familiar with.
This group emerged during the French Revolution.
Okay.
So essentially, the French Revolution had many people that were you could consider exactly like the American revolutionaries. Like they had some of their people that are their own, like Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, whatnot. Well, as the French Revolution continued going on and things continued to go badly, you had many people within the revolution that were very opportunistic and had very utopianist ideas of what they wanted. And by extension of utopianist, they were also very authoritarian. Well, with all this chaos going on, internally and externally, because there was civil unrest within the country, like civil war, and then foreign threat as well from the Austrians and the British and whatnot. The French, they're essentially the French Parliament. They were called, I believe, the National Convention at the time, but it was essentially their French Parliament. Decided to commit to create a temporary group called the Committee of Public Safety, which was very ironic, which we will get to eventually soon enough here.
Okay.
Which the Committee of Public Safety would eventually would be put in charge of dealing with these domestic and foreign threats, and they would essentially become judge, jury, and executioner. Because they would, and also the legislator, judicial, and executive branch. Initially, it was 9 members. They would eventually go up to 12 members, and they would be the 12 most powerful people in the new French Republic, and essentially the de facto leaders in a way. And also you had a figure within this group who was the most influential figure, and you could say kind of the leader, which is a man by the name of Maximilien de Robespierre.
Okay.
Who he believed essentially have a utopianist idea in which old men were created. Well, old men is a good idea, but he essentially wanted to recreate humanity. He wanted to have like a pure idea of what he wanted as a human being, and instead of using debating and persuasion to do with all this, he believed in something else to do this, which was state terrorism, which he ushered in the darkest chapter of the French Revolution called the Reign of Terror. Which,
wait, is this the guy from Les Mis? I mean, is this guy a character, or is he referenced in Les Mis?
He may have been, but he basically believed that in order to achieve perfection, purity, which is getting very fascistic here, he believed that utilizing the state apparatus to terrorize who he considered to be enemies of the people.
Okay.
Which he is the first person in history to use that term. That term is a tribute to him, and that term actually came from Nero, but they didn't say it like that. They called him the enemy of the people, and then that was the enemy of the people was derived from that, or it may have been called something else. But anyways, essentially he came up with this term in which he would use the state apparatus to persecute anybody he considered to be counter-revolutionary, which is more, a heretic, essentially, to not be as revolutionary as him. So about 17,000 people were executed by guillotine. Well, not all by guillotine. Some people were shot or drowned. Yeah, mass drownings did happen. 300,000 people were arrested, and 10,000 died in prison from like malnourishment, disease, what have you. The most there's a event called the Vendang uprising, in which essentially a group within France uprised citizens and whatnot, and then the Committee of Public Safety sent in the troops. And I know civilian wise, it killed about 20 to 50,000 civilians, but they were not considered. It's weird in which that's not considered. Some people consider that to be a statistic of the Reign of Terror. Some people think it's just a byproduct, but kind of is. And which and also the mass drownings happened during this time as well, in which you had priests, you had women and children getting massively drowned in a lake, which was eventually nicknamed the nation in the Nans. It's called the Nans Massacre. Which was called the nation's bloodbath, or the nation's bathtub, in which they would just drown people. And as this campaign kept going on, Robespierre started becoming more and more crazy, in which he started turning on former allies like Danton, who was a former member of the Committee of Public Safety, but then I think he eventually quit, and he started distancing himself from Robespierre and that part of the French Revolution. It just became crazy because he started turning on people, and before because he was eventually executed, he eventually became a victim of his own purges. He started a cult, called the Cult of the Supreme Being. He started his own cult, which was a deistic cult, because he wasn't really for organized religion, but for deism he was, and it was a deistic cult he created.
Okay.
And he eventually met his demise when he went in front of the French National Assembly and said, like, on this piece of paper, I have 3 members that are members of this parliament that are counter-revolutionaries. And they're like, all right, who it is? He's like, I'm not going to tell you. And it's like, and they're like, are you threatening us? And essentially he was threatening them. And they eventually, because the Committee of Public Safety didn't have all the political power, they were not the sole like rulers. The French National Assembly still existed. So the French National Assembly essentially used his threat there as an excuse to basically go after him. And him and some of his followers, he got arrested, and then he broke out of jail, and then he ended up going to this palace or some sort of building, and it was him and 2 other people. One guy jumped out of the window and fell into a bunch of bayonets. Oof. Another guy basically blew his brains out with a pistol, and then Robespierre attempted to do the same, but what it seems that he tried to do, because people don't know what happened, how he got because essentially what happened, it seems like he tried to commit suicide himself the same way as the other guy, but he botched it badly, which he just blew off his fucking jaw. And when the guards bursted in there, they saw him with his like jaw bleeding and the gun right there and whatnot, and you can put 2 and 2 together and like, oh, he tried to kill himself. And they essentially arrested him, and eventually found him guilty very quickly and sentenced him to guillotine along with many of his allies. And they brought him to the guillotine, and because he had a rag there that was holding his jaw together, the executioner really couldn't get Robespierre into the hole. So he essentially had to rip the bandage off, which was holding Robespierre's jaw together, which made Robespierre just scream in agony. It just made him scream. And then eventually those screams went away once that blade landed on his neck. And for 15 minutes, the crowd cheered.
Well, you weren't popular when that happened.
So, 2 things to take away from that with the dictatorship of the proletariat, that it essentially was a legitimate dictatorship, that the revolutionary elites were going to basically take over and impose dictatorship and terrorism, which would become staples of communist regimes, dictatorship and terrorism upon the populace, and which is a focal point of Lenin's ideology, Leninism, which Lenin essentially believed that, well, the dictatorship of proletariat would be an elite group of people that would overthrow the bourgeoisie, and then implement their dictatorship, and then to enforce their dictatorship, they would use Jacobin like terrorism towards the opposition, which is what there's more to Leninism, but those are 2 ideologies, 2 main ideas: complete one-party dictatorship and terrorism against all who oppose that. And so yeah, Lenin was never good. And Trotsky was never good either. Trotsky, because essentially
I don't actually know what Trotsky did that was wrong.
So Trotsky,
I know he ultimately was one of the people that the Communist Party pushed out.
Yeah. So yeah, that's pretty much true. So it's interesting because in 1899 there was a left-wing coalition group called the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party formed. This was a coalition. It did not have a concrete ideology. You had people that were like center left all the way to authoritarian left in it.
It is worth noting that Russia did also purge anyone who was more of a straight Marxist.
Yes.
Because their beliefs were too close to anarchism and straight Marxism, they had to be pushed out because they would have ultimately threatened the authoritarian establishment that they were establishing.
Oh yeah. This is also true. And essentially, this coalition group was formed called the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party in 1899. This was a coalition. They didn't really have a concrete ideology, like we believe this idea was like we're a left-wing alliance that's opposed to the Tsarist regime. Well, this party eventually would break apart.
Of course, because their beliefs probably weren't actually that compatible.
Well, that and Lenin. He's basically the reason why it broke apart. Because Lenin published a book in 1902, I believe it was, called What Is to Be Done? This is his claim to fame, which basically laid out Leninism. And when this was read amongst other members of the group, basically they accused him of being a Robespierrist, a Jacobin, an authoritarian, you name it.
Pretty fair.
And then basically, and Lenin proudly said like, he would eventually say, the Bolsheviks are the Jacobins of the 20th century. He would later say this, but a year later is when the party split apart, in which you had one party which was pro-Lenin, which were the Bolsheviks, and then the other side were the Mensheviks. Now, what Bolshevik and Menshevik mean in Russian is that Bolshevik means majority, Menshevik means minority, but the reality was that nobody really had the majority or minority over each other. There were people that would switch sides and whatnot. And for the longest time until 1917, Trotsky was a Menshevik. He was not a Bolshevik. On the other hand, Stalin was a Bolshevik. He was a Bolshevik longer than Trotsky, which you could say probably helped Stalin end.
So, from the sound of it, Trotsky is involved with the Bolsheviks at some point, though.
Until 1917, when things really started rolling around. Because what happened was that...
what year did they take down the Tsar?
So, many people don't know this, but there was a thing called the February Revolution, which was really the actual revolution in Russia. And the February Revolution the Bolsheviks had nothing to be a part of it. They had no part of it at all. Lenin was, I think, somewhere in Western Europe. Trotsky was here. Everyone was apart. The Bolsheviks had nothing to do with it. Basically, the February Revolution was a popular revolution that was put in place by mostly moderate socialists and people that had more liberal and democratic values that overthrew the Tsar. That's when the Tsar was overthrown. A lot of people don't know that.
I do think that most people are under the impression that the Bolsheviks overthrew the Tsar.
That's Soviet propaganda. They basically completely lied. Now, what is called the October Revolution...
I blame you, animated Anastasia cartoon. Anyways.
Yeah, that's a common misconception. That was not the revolution that overthrew the Tsar. It was the February Revolution that was done by Kerensky and a bunch of other people. And essentially, the October Revolution was really not a revolution. It was a coup d'etat.
As they often are.
The Bolsheviks did not have majority of support as well at all. Essentially, what happened was that the Tsar abdicated after the February Revolution, and a group called and then the Provisional Government was set apart, which the Provisional Government eventually became the short-lived Russian Republic, which was eventually overthrown by the Bolsheviks in a coup d'etat. And the Bolsheviks did not have majority support at all. And around this time, 1917, to pretty much get Russia out of the war, the Germans shipped Lenin to Moscow, or to St. Petersburg, as it was called, because initially St. Petersburg for a while was the capital of Russia. Lenin moved it to Moscow. But back then, St. Petersburg wasn't even called St. Petersburg because the Tsar he changed it from St. Petersburg to Petrograd because St. Petersburg to him sounded too German, even though Tsar Nicholas II had German heritage. And that didn't
compensating.
Yeah. I mean, it was kind of similar with the French Revolution because there's many people within France that did not like Marie Antoinette because she wasn't French, she was Austrian. Similar thing happened with the Tsars, basically with Tsar Nicholas II and his family. Tsar Nicholas II had Russian heritage, but he also had a lot of German heritage. You could say a lot of Russian nationalists within Tsarist Russia viewed him as more German than Russian, and also his wife was German. So he wasn't really up to their standard. And and whatnot. And Tsar Nicholas II also didn't want to rule anyways. When his father died, yeah, it was, I believe, yeah, it was, I believe his father or grandfather. No, his grandfather was assassinated in the 1880s, and his father took over. And eventually, a decade later, I believe his father died, and then Tsar Nicholas II, he did not want to rule at all. He did not want to rule. He was a family man. He just wanted to spend time with his family. He didn't want to rule. And by this point, Tsarist Russia was already going down the hill, and they had to change really quickly. And the Bolsheviks did not, the communists did not have popular support at all. The only really thing that they really had support with was ending World War One, Russia's involvement with World War One, which the provisional government really didn't do a good job at doing. They did a good job with everything else except for ending Russia's involvement in World War One. Mm-hmm. And the Bolsheviks' whole slogan was "peace, bread, and land," which would be very ironic very soon, because essentially when the Bolsheviks did a coup d'état against the Russian Republic, that kickstarted the Russian Civil War, which in World War One, Russia's casualties were about 3 million. Half of that was civilian, other half was soldiers. The Russian Civil War, on the other hand, was 10 to 12 million people dead. So Lenin really didn't promise peace. He promised, you do what I say or you die.
I think I'm getting a good idea of why Russia's population is nowhere near what America's is.
Yeah. And Lenin believed essentially killing anybody that opposed his government. He had his own reign of terror, which was called the Red Terror, or as I like to call it, the Red Inquisition. Because why I like to call it the Red.
I was going to say I've heard of the Red Terror. Why Inquisition?
Because the most well-known. Oh, let me check the time here.
Oh yes, it is 7:04.
Oh, so we have plenty of time.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Really, I mean, I've been to daily press at like 8, and sometimes it's like only 5th or 6th person up, so we have time.
Vaughn's got to get to a comedy show after this, people.
But essentially, what happened? Where did I? The Red Terror, yeah.
Yes, the Red
Terror.
Why
I call
the Red Inquisition, yes.
That's why I like to nickname the Red Inquisition. The reason why I like to nickname it that is because the best historian on Russian history is a guy named Lando Fidge.
Okay.
Who's British, and he basically said that the ingenuity of the torture techniques and the diversity of them and the cruelty of them that was done by the Bolsheviks, particularly their secret police to Cheka during the Red Terror, were on par with the torture techniques during the Spanish Inquisition. He said it matches the cruelty of that, which, the Cheka were very cruel. They there was a long variety of torture techniques they would do, and essentially during the Civil War, each Cheka lieutenant had their own territory essentially, and they had their own preference of how they like to torture people, which would range from scalping, crucifixion, skinning people alive. During the winter times, they would some Cheka units would like to throw people out naked and then douse in 0 degrees below, in the negatives. Have them go out there naked and then douse them with water, and a bunch of you had people get people naked and put them in barrels filled with nails and then roll them around. It was just, basically during the Russian Civil War, all sides committed atrocities, all sides committed war crimes. The Bolsheviks, on the other hand, were the champions of cruelty and violence, because they were well more organized than their opposition, the White Army, which the White Army essentially were a loose coalition of themselves, of people that were czarists, liberals, anarchists, non-Bolshevik socialists, you name it. But they weren't really very well coordinated, and there was a thing called the White Terror, but that was not very well organized as the Red Terror. The Red Terror was very well organized, and it was really put together very well, and to kind of just put the mindset of the violence and the brutality and how Lenin and his top brass did not care really of how many people died was that the head of the secret police, Fyodor Dzerzhinsky, who's basically the architect of the Red Terror, he he during one meeting, this is very famous. During one meeting, he came to Lenin.
Okay.
And said that he gave him a list about 1,000 people that were being kept in the jails in Moscow. And he gave the list to Lenin, and Lenin looked at it and he did a cross off. And the reason why he crossed it off was to show Dzerzhinsky that he read it. Dzerzhinsky, on the other hand, did not interpret it that way. So that night, all of them were executed. And I doubt Lenin really cared. He's like, well, they were probably counter-revolutionaries anyways. Damn. So, yeah, Lenin did order executions, though unlike Stalin, he didn't revel in it. He wasn't really like, yeah. Mm-hmm. Lenin was bloodthirsty, but he wasn't sadistic.
Mm-hmm. For him, it was more about the power he was achieving.
Oh, yeah, it was Lenin's ideology is pretty much summed up as the ends justify the means. Essentially, that's his ideology, and he did not care of how many people suffered or how many people died in whatever way. He really wanted to just go for it, and to really just, I mean, the cruelest thing during the Russian Civil War that Lenin ever did was that the Russian famine of the early 20s, which was brought upon the Civil War that the Bolsheviks pretty much caused, the poor growing season, and a policy that the Bolsheviks implemented called war communism, which essentially was that in order to feed the Red Army and to feed their supporters within the cities, which is really where the Bolshevik supporters were in the cities, they would have forced grain quotas from the peasantry. And this is how much peasants were, the percentage of old Russia at the time. 17 to 80% were peasants, and they were going to steal grain from them. And this caused the famine to happen. And essentially, and this, I get why they did it, but at the end of the day, this was just straight up cruel. This was straight up just authoritarian and cruel to do this. There's no way to look at it. Like, oh, a means to my ends ass. This is just straight up cruel to do this. And so to top this off, during the famine, to help consolidate power more, because he couldn't really do this before the famine, Lenin was, a staunch anti-religious atheist. He wanted to get rid of the Russian Orthodox Church. Yes. He couldn't really do it before the famine because the peasantry would get up in arms because they were very religious.
Of course.
But during the famine, while the peasants are busy starving and eating each other and all that, he could go after the church, which is really just the most cruelest, really just callous thing you could do. Which is just straight up deplorable to really think of this. Instead of like, oh, we should do something to help out the civilian populace, the peasantry that are starving. Oh, I'm going to use this to take advantage of this to go after the church.
Okay,
that's his thinking, and which is just completely that's just completely despicable.
Well, I mean, most of the things that authoritarian leaders do are pretty despicable.
Yeah.
I shouldn't say by definition. That's dumb. All right. So this is a lot of very interesting history.
And also another thing about that caused the Civil War to happen was that the provisional government set up their own parliament, which I can't think of the name of it, but Lenin would eventually kind of do a coup d'etat against that parliament in January. He pretty much forcibly dissolved it. So old powers of the Bolsheviks and whatnot. There's a lot of things that happened during the Russian Civil War that were just completely despicable on the Bolsheviks' part. They were never heroes. They were always the villains. And much like Dzerzhinsky as well joined the Bolsheviks in 1917. And Trotsky did as well, because I think I don't know what was going through Trotsky. I don't know. Trotsky is very, if you look into him, he's just very elitist and very snobby and very, because he came from a wealthy family. And Dzerzhinsky did it as well. So they probably...
What caused him... Was he pushed out or did he flee?
So essentially what happened with Trotsky was that Trotsky joined in 1917. So he was very late to the party. Stalin was there way longer than him. Trotsky, what happened with him was that after Lenin died, shortly right after Lenin died, there was two camps. There's pro-Stalin and then pro-Trotsky.
Oh.
So Trotsky, what he wanted to do was that he wanted to continue the revolution, spreading it outward, which is what Lenin did during the Civil War as well, to a certain extent, until
makes sense.
Until he pretty much completely failed to annex Poland. Because his plan there was that he wanted to annex Poland and the Baltic states, and then use that as a bridge to Germany, which was experiencing revolutionary fervor, and and he was even being more optimistic. He wanted to spreading revolution is essentially his term for annexation. Okay. He wanted to also annex Hungary and Italy. He wanted to really continue in Europe, which is essentially what Trotsky wanted to do. He wanted to spend all this money and effort and resources to basically spread the revolution.
Okay.
That's what Trotsky wanted to do. Stalin was more reasonable, and he realized, like, well, we just got a civil war, so we need to, focus all our resources, energy on improving the country, which it makes sense why he ended up winning out on Trotsky. And
well, he was ruthless.
Oh, that as well. And also,
have you ever seen? Oh, I know I'm getting ahead of myself.
Death of Stalin?
Yeah, no, it's just...
Is that the movie?
Well, it's the movie I was going to ask you about, but that is jumping ahead of.
Yeah,
that's after he dies. But,
yeah.
But now that I know that Trotsky was the opposition to Stalin, it makes sense that he.
But even though Trotsky was opposition to Stalin, he was still authoritarian in his own right.
Yeah, no, but I mean, it makes sense that he would have either been thrown out or fled the country after Stalin took power.
Well, also, a lot of people don't know about Stalin, but Stalin was, this trait would become way worse towards the end of his life. But Stalin was an anti-Semite. Trotsky was Jewish.
Oh, yeah.
Trotsky was Jewish. Now, there are other Jewish people that were pro-Stalin, that favored Stalin over Trotsky.
Choices.
Well, the thing with Trotsky that, other than him being Jewish, that rubbed Stalin the wrong way, was that Trotsky was a complete elitist. And he viewed Stalin nothing but a two-bit thug. And this also comes even worse when you know the backgrounds of both Stalin and Trotsky. Trotsky came from a wealthy family. His father was a very successful farmer, very wealthy. Stalin, on the other hand, came from a fucking dirt poor Georgian family. And Trotsky, one of the reasons why he did not like Stalin is because Stalin never went to university, and he looked down upon him about that, which really rubbed Stalin really the wrong way. Along with just Trotsky being like
that makes me feel bad to say that he wasn't far off when he called Stalin a two-bit thug, though.
Yeah, but at the same time, these are supposed.
Elitism's not cool.
Well, the classism of it as well. Basically, these are supposed to be like, internationalists, but that just comes off as classist. Him looking down upon Stalin.
Yeah. True.
Because he never went to university. He wasn't studied Marxism and whatnot like the other ones. So he just looked down upon Stalin like that. And Stalin. Those are actually kind of things that Lenin actually liked about Stalin. Stalin came from a very poor family. He liked that because it showed that he came from a humble background. He was also an ethnic minority. He was Georgian. And also, Stalin was also very loyal. He was a very, very loyal guy. He, before Trotsky ever joined the group, with the direction of Lenin, and Stalin had his part in it as well, they robbed a bank in modern-day Georgia, in Stalin's home country, which up to 40 people died. 50 people were injured.
That's a pretty nuts bank robbery.
Oh, yeah. And I think majority of those casualties were civilians. So there was a lot of civilian collateral damage, which, of course, kind of, in hindsight, it makes sense why.
That's a crazy bank robbery, actually.
And they couldn't really use any of the money at all. At the end of the day, it was pointless, basically. They couldn't use the money because a lot of the money was basically... I don't know the full because I'm not a banker, but the money
if over 40 people die in your bank robbery, that's a fucked up bank robbery.
Oh, yeah,
that is not normal.
Yeah, Stalin had he participated in it. Lenin didn't participate in it. He wasn't one of the robbers. He was the
like a more behind the scenes.
Yeah, he was behind the scenes. But Stalin, he came from a rough background. He came from nitty gritty. He participated in it because he basically grew up in that kind of environment, so it didn't really bother him. He participated and whatnot, and that was kind of the taste of the sociopathic nature of the Bolsheviks, that they didn't really care, and they really just cared about themselves and what they wanted. It's very paternalistic how they viewed people. It's like, oh, we know what's best for you guys.
Yeah,
essentially like that. It was very paternalism.
Ironically, very hierarchical thinking as well.
Oh yeah. And really, and then, as I mentioned before with Marx, and how Marx viewed human beings, because Marx, if you do look, he did not believe in the idea of human nature at all.
Now, I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, just based on the things that I've read of Marx. But Marx is also considered one of the fathers of modernism. And modernism basically indicates that people are essentially biological, psychological, and economical.
Well, Marx kind of got that idea because that idea that the rejection of human, that idea originates from French Enlightenment philosopher Rousseau.
Okay.
Who Rousseau essentially believed. Rousseau was what you would consider like a left-wing reactionary in a way.
Okay.
Wasn't much of a revolutionary, as Rousseau essentially believed that pre-civilization times, human beings were living in utopia. We were nothing was wrong. We were living in utopia and everything. Then civilization came and ruined our utopia. And essentially, Rousseau wanted to go back to the utopia. He wanted to go back to pre-civilization time. And this is kind of where, his
idea.
And this is kind of where Marx kind of drew DNA inspiration from, but really in the middle ground you had the Jacobins, Robespierre and all of them.
Yeah.
They took a lot of inspiration from Rousseau, and this is what Rousseau believed. And then
this is also the stuff that Tyler Durden's talking about in Fight Club, for anyone keeping score.
Yeah. So it turns out that the far left are more reactionary than we thought.
Now, I just want to make sure we're on the same page. When you say reactionary, what?
A reactionary is basically going back to the good old days before, because really, if you think about it, going back
to. So you would define reactionary as almost a
nostalgia.
Okay.
Nostalgia. Essentially, Rousseau was more of a reactionary than a revolutionary, though you can say that a lot of
now.
You could say really a lot of communists and the anarchists are more reactionary than revolutionary because it has that DNA network that traces back to Rousseau, which they want to go back to a stateless, moneyless, we just want communes and everything. Well, it turns out that was never true, and it turns out that Rousseau was fucking wrong.
There's no evidence that such an existence ever occurred.
Well, with archaeological discoveries and whatnot, it turns out that pre-civilization time, human beings were always pieces of shit. It seems like
there's also lots of historical evidence that human beings also always took care of each other too.
Well, so there's a dichotomy there. It's not 100%. Of course, human beings, like you said, way before are complicated.
Yeah.
Because the fact that we're sentient makes us very complicated because we evolved from lower beings, and lower beings like animals, like whatnot, are very vicious. And
this is true. Animals are terrible.
And a lot of our negative, behavior that human beings exhibit are from our animal ancestors, essentially, because it's on our DNA. It's where we basically came from the ground up. But even though we came from the ground up, that makes us even more complicated.
Yeah.
Even though we're sentient, we're still way more complicated.
Chimpanzees are not enlightened creatures.
Yeah, they're not.
They are sociopathic, murdering fucking machines.
And it turns out through archaeological discoveries and whatnot that human beings have always been at each other's throats because there's cave drawings of humans basically pointing spears at each other. And what you have to imagine that pre-civilization times, the main thing that human beings wanted the most when we were just cavemen were food and women. And we would go, it always reminds me, like whenever I think about it, it always reminds me of the beginning of 2001 Space Odyssey, when you had those two tribes of like pre-humans and like, oh, a bone I can hit.
The monolith makes them realize they can use tools.
Yeah, and then
he hits the guy with the bone.
Yeah, because there's a different like caveman tribe that was like hogging the water, like the lake that they were drinking at, and they went over and like, we can get them. We can get them away with this weapon. Like, oh, and that kind of, as 2001 Space Odyssey showed us, that's the invention of weapons, and it just evolves from that. And also with human beings, because we're complicated, like fully caring about one another is very impossible based upon our biology. And this comes from evolution because human beings have a limit of how many relationships we can have, which the limit is 150 people. And this is because to not overwhelm us. Because if you start carrying more than that, like into the thousands, it'll just completely overwhelm us. So biologically, we're conditioned to basically have a set of how many people we can actually care about. So, this whole like utopianist internationalism. Oh, nope, that's old bullshit. That completely goes against. Now, yes, we are shown to basically care about people, and we should make efforts to care about people and try to improve better. I'm not trying to be a cynic or a pessimist. We should have effort to basically go ahead.
Just to balance this out, we also have lots of historical archaeological evidence now for how cave people took care of each other.
Yes,
and this actually includes cave people with like disabilities. We found the remains of people with spina bifida who had been taken care of by their tribe into what it would have been considered much higher life expectancy than one would assume for a cave person with spina bifida or other forms of disorders or physical disabilities. But at the same time, like this is partly because early tribes are based around the only natural hierarchy in nature, which is the family. And that's sort of where civilization comes out of multiple tribes when they start coming together and cooperating. So there is civilization is actually a good thing.
Yes,
is the takeaway.
Yeah. Like we've never really been anarchistic as a species. No, like really species is. There's always.
I mean, that depends on how you define anarchism, but yes,
because there's always been like some sort of order. Like you have like a kind of like a top down. I mean, it doesn't have to be draconian top down.
I mean, I'm not a pro hierarchy person necessarily because a lot of hierarchies are artificial, and like I said, there are actually only two naturally occurring hierarchies. They are teacher and student and family. Everything else is pretty much something we designed for power structure purposes.
Kind of like money, but when you think about it, money is actually good because
I'm not going to totally agree with that, but
I would argue with that money is good because really, if you don't have money, people just hoard shit.
I mean, people hoard money though.
Oh yeah, they will do that, but you need to have
people still hoard stuff.
Oh, I agree with that. I don't disagree with that at all. But you need to have like some sort of balancing act.
I mean, the purpose of money is to be essentially the wild card in our societal game of Uno.
Yeah,
it's the only thing that you use it because it allows you to get everything. Instead of having to aggressively barter like your whatever for whatever, which one of my libertarian friends was all about that, by the way. I had a libertarian friend who always thought going back to a barter system would somehow solve the problem. It's like, what? All I can think is, what the fuck are you talking about? We can't go back to a barter system at this point. That's ridiculous. It's friggin'. That's. First of all, you don't have enough stuff to barter for everything that you need. No.
Yeah, I do agree with that. Money's not entirely good, but you could say it's a necessity that kind of because I mean, people do hoard shit. Like, you need to have like some sort of middle ground. There's people that just want absolute, like I want like absolutism. But sometimes, the things that move us forward and are more effective tend to be things that are like in the middle ground. Like compromise. Compromise is
the way I look at it is that everything is more about like growth and development.
Yeah.
And the reality is that you can't just, when you're talking about growth and development, there isn't like a part where you can just like skip ahead to like the next step. In fact, actually, if you in Dust Capital, it lays out the fact that capitalism is actually not separate from communism. Capitalism is like the infancy of communism. You start with capitalism because capitalism is the most effective way to bring people together initially and also build infrastructure. As you move into socialism, socialism is the transference of essentially just the means of production to the people who actually use the means of production. Communism, which has never been fully achieved because honestly, I don't even know if it can be, or if it's just a matter of the fact that it would take so long to naturally get to this outcome. But the point is that true like Marxist communism would be a stateless, powerless, classless, moneyless society. Everyone would just understand their place and like what they were supposed to do to contribute to society, while at the same time maintaining their own individual freedom. That's never happened. And the people who move towards communism or try to claim communism never truly, like, you can't have what I'm describing and also have a Stalin. You can't have what I'm describing and also have a communist party. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't even out.
I do know that it may have been in the Communist Manifesto. There was something that you could say was a proto of the Vanguard Party, which is essentially what Lenin was
what
arguing.
they ultimately went with.
Marx did talk about something like that with the revolution. He's like, like the revolutionary leadership. So it was kind of like a proto to the Vanguard Party. So like a lot of the things that like turn out very badly with trying to implement communism were kind of there in the beginning,
because they're all stuff that ties into like the human drives for like power. And like tribalism.
And also the fact that, Marx and Engels came from wealthy families didn't help that at all. Like for Marx, his father was a very successful lawyer, and his mom came from a wealthy Dutch family. Engels, on the other hand, his father was an industrialist. So these were upper class people, and to really think that
makes sense though, because ultimately what they were writing about was industrialism.
And the fact that they came from these like very privileged backgrounds shows that they really had no kind of idea what people really wanted. It's like, well, I know what I want for you. It's like, what why you think that? And it's like, well, I come from a privileged background. I mean, of course they didn't say that, but I think that was kind of ingrained in their minds in a way.
This is interesting, because this is actually, to go over to another author, democratic socialist George Orwell initially, like, this is the type of thing that made George Orwell initially like despise like socialists and communists, is because they would all just be these elitist douchebags, and that annoyed the shit out of him. But then he actually ended up in like going to these industrialized areas, and he suddenly realized that he did believe in democratic socialism. George Orwell's a really interesting guy.
Oh yeah, I'm sure he really is. Matter of fact, because since I mentioned you already mentioned your political official.
Sure.
Again, democratic socialism. With me, social democracy. It's very interesting how social democracy started, because social democracy really started in response to Soviet Union, when with Lenin and doing all that stuff. Particularly with one of the biggest figures, Karl Kautsky, who really is considered one of the godfathers of modern day social democracy, because what he was seeing in what the Bolsheviks were doing in Russia earlier on, thought was completely. He's like, this is cruel. Because he even like wrote these pamphlets criticizing the Bolsheviks and using terrorism to get their way. And there was a pissing contest between him and Lenin, and eventually Trotsky got into it. And they were just like writing these pamphlets trying to debunk one another, and it turns out Karl Kautsky was right all along. He basically won out. And if anybody doesn't know what social democracy is, it essentially makes peace between capitalism and socialism.
A good example of social democracies are typically Scandinavian countries.
Or Bernie Sanders.
Or, I mean, he
on an individual level.
Yeah, although Bernie Sanders describes himself as a democratic socialist. However, it is worth noting that his actual brand of democratic socialism looks a lot like European centrism because of, well, how far to the right America is.
Yeah. And it's interesting because Europe has a lot of social democratic parties.
This is true.
Like the Weimar Republic was founded by the German Social Democratic Party. Because a lot of people don't know this, but Germany had their own revolution towards the end of World War One. In 1918, they overthrew the Kaiser, the Social Democrats, kind of like how the moderates, socialists, so the Russia overthrew the czars. They overthrew, and you could kind of say that the Federal Revolutionaries were kind of social democrats. You can kind of say that.
I mean,
Hungarian socialists,
socialists and communists and whatnot were all very common in Germany right before Hitler rose to power. And actually, some of the problem, and this is an important lesson, provided the story I've read was true, but this is an important lesson for America today, okay? So the communists in Germany, right before Hitler got elected, were talking about, hey, don't even bother voting. Don't even bother voting. Yep. And the reason they thought this was because, well, as soon as a fascist actually gets in there, then everyone will realize how bad it is, and then we'll get them. That's when they'll be ready to revolutionize. But I hate to tell you this, but accelerationism is fucking stupid. Accelerationism just makes sure that your opponent has the upper hand. What is wrong with you?
Oh yeah, I was about to.
And then what happened? Hitler killed all those communists who didn't vote. That's what happened.
Yeah, I was kind of going eventually get into that, but they overthrew the Kaiser, and it was also a popular revolution. The 1918 German Revolution. This was supported by the people and whatnot. And then early 1919, that same German Communist Party that we were talking about, they attempted a coup called the Spartacus Uprising. They attempted a coup d'etat, and they thought like, oh, we're going to be like the Bolsheviks and overthrow them. They completely failed, and it basically just made things worse because with the fact that the Bolsheviks and Russia were trying to expand territory.
And that probably just made it easier for Hitler to blame communists for everything.
Yep. Well, the fact that they tried to do a coup, the German Communist Party tried to attempt a coup, and the fact that Lenin wanted to expand territory, or as he says, expand the revolution, helped bring Hitler to power and the Nazis. And the fact that the Bolsheviks were very open with state terrorism. This was very well known that they were very open with terrorism and executing and torturing and imprisoning their rivals.
Which probably only made it easier for Hitler and his party to stage the burning of the Reichstag and blame it on communists.
Yes.
Since that was already a technique of the Bolsheviks.
Yes, and also to make matters worse is that by this time in the 1933 elections, in order to get your seats in the Reichstag, because in Germany, and it might still be like this in Germany, but in order for a political party to get seats in the Reichstag, they essentially had to form coalitions. So the German Social Democrats offered to partner up with the German Communists, but due to the fact that they both had bad blood, with the Communists trying to do a coup against them, and also the fact that essentially the German Communist Party did not have any autonomy, they were listening to Stalin. They were following everything he wanted, and Stalin hated the Social Democrats more than he hated the Nazis. He hated them way more than the Nazis. And then, matter of fact, on the same end, Hitler hated the Social Democrats and he hated the Communists. Because he hated the Weimar Republic. He did not like it at all. And by refusing to...
And also they tied Jewishism, being Jewish in with being a communist was another thing that Hitler did as well.
Yeah, and that's due to the fact that there was a lot of Jewish people that joined revolutionary groups because of the conditions in Tsarist Russia. Not because they're evil or whatever, but a lot of them joined revolutionary groups because of the horrible conditions in Tsarist Russia. And it just happens that some of the most prominent members of the Bolsheviks were Jewish. Like, for example, Lenin was Jewish, but he didn't even know he was Jewish until his sister found out in the early 30s.
Oh, wow.
And when she brought that to Stalin, Stalin's like, do not reveal this to the public at all. He did not want...
That's on brand for him.
And yeah, Lenin was Jewish, Trotsky was Jewish, a couple other members were Jewish as well, some of the prominent members. And the fact that Trotsky was one Jewish person, I mean, Stalin in general didn't like any Jewish people.
Mhm.
He tolerated some more than others.
Mhm.
Trotsky being the one he did not tolerate at all. But when the time came right, he purged all of them. People like Kamenev, who would be the brother-in-law to Trotsky, because Kamenev, or maybe another one around, but they basically became family members by marriage because one of them married one of their sisters and whatnot, and
So
yeah.
so how do you feel about the world today?
Well, at least it's not the early 20th century. I mean,
It's certain parts kind of feel like the early 20th century, though.
it does. I mean, yeah, I mean, Trump I know damn well with particularly with this last debate, Trump's damn well not going to get elected.
I hope not.
I have a feeling because Kamala Harris came off as very competent and very effective.
Yeah.
Trump, on the other hand, just came off as fucking delusional as hell. Like, they're eating our cats and dogs.
And yet there are people who are defending him online.
He has like a very cult of personality, and it's kind of like how I was talking.
That's what scares me.
Yeah, that is.
If we're talking about all these terrible authoritarians, and what's the thing they have in common? Cult of personality.
Yeah. Though the one thing I can give Lenin over Trump is that well,
no, I want to hear it.
Well, two things was that Lenin was actually became a legit authoritarian, like a legit a dictator, and also he actually did a successful coup. That's the two things that Lenin have over Trump, which are not, could say even worse, but
what we're saying, Trump, is that the thing you don't have in common with these people is success.
Yes, essentially. You never became a successful dictator, and you never became successful at doing a coup d'etat.
And you never became successful at owning casinos, and you never...
Yeah, that's a very common thing, because some people in this country think that only rich people or these far right-wing loonies and whatnot. But as I said before, it's not just right wingers. There's a lot of people on the fringe left that are basically come from very wealthy families and have these kind of very out of touch, very delusional ideas.
Everybody rich is out of touch.
Yeah, essentially. Be it Karl Marx, be it Donald Trump, be it Mao Zedong, be it Elon Musk.
Oh my God! Have you seen any of Elon Musk's recent interviews?
Oh, well, I know he wants to impregnate Taylor Swift.
That's
that's very his Twitter, which I still go on. There's a lot of people that are very openly fascist or even communist or anti-Semitic. I mean, as I said before, the communist movements, I would say starting with Lenin and particularly with Stalin, became very nationalistic. Because there's a lot of
that's another key thing that all these things have in common is extreme nationalism.
Yeah, there's a lot of communists are nationalists and are openly racist, and very homophobic as well. There's a lot of homophobia and transphobia within communist
especially
circles.
The Tankies.
Oh yeah,
if you've ever heard Yankee Tanky talk about stuff, he's very actually this makes sense because Russia is currently pushing a lot of this anti-woke nature is actually Russian talking points that are being pushed into our society. Because Russia right now is doing this whole thing where they've gone essentially Christian nationalist, which is interesting because Putin used to be in the KGB.
And you couldn't be religious at all in the Communist Party. You had to be a atheist, a secular atheist. And they try to, it was very weird with them because they try to, because the one thing that Soviet Union and Nazi Germany had in common was scientism, which they really try to say well, science is going to solve everything. Because contrary to popular belief, because some people think Nazi Germany were Christian nationalists, they were not Christian at all.
This is a thing I've actually researched about the Germans, and their relationship with religion is very weird and interesting. For starters, Hitler was confirmed Catholic, and by that I mean he went through confirmation.
Yeah.
However, there is no record of him attending church after this moment. The German party took the Bible and they edited out everything that was Jewish,
Yeah,
and made it the German Bible. He would go to various. A lot of people have said he persecuted the atheist clubs, but this is only half true. What would happen is he would go to atheist clubs and he'd be like, will you swear allegiance to Hitler? And they'd be like, no. And then he'd be like, well, you're fucked.
yeah.
And if an atheist group did swear allegiance to Hitler, they got to stay. But and it's been written by both Goring and Himmler in their personal journals that interestingly enough, each of them believed that Hitler's religious beliefs were closer to their own, which were, in the case of Goring, was an atheist, and Himmler was like a weird occultist.
Yeah, he was like
type pagan guy. Yeah, neo-pagan.
Yeah, neo-pagan. Like a lot of the Nazi officials had very weird beliefs. Like Heydrich was a anti-religious atheist. He did not like religion at all.
It was required to be some type of religion to be in the SS, but that's because Himmler ran it.
Like Nazi Germany, like Nazism was more of its religion itself. It was a political religion.
Yes.
And it's even revealed in a book called Hitler's Table Talks, in which it was like private conversations between him and his close advisors that Hitler both hated Christianity and Judaism because essentially most people don't know this, but when Jesus died, Jesus really didn't found Christianity. His followers did, and Jesus's movement was a Jewish movement, and most of his followers were both religiously and ethnically Jewish. So really his followers after he died created the Bible, the New Testament, and they were all Jewish, which is why Hitler did not like Christianity, because he viewed it as a Jewish religion, along with, of course, Judaism itself.
But he maintained it as part of the state power because he viewed it as being useful for controlling and manipulating the populace. Or at least that's what Goring and Himmler both wrote in their journals.
Yeah, because the majority of the populace were Christian, and also, they also didn't want to alienate the population because the Bolsheviks were doing that. They were openly executing priests and destroying religious temples, and they didn't want to be like, oh, you guys are no different from the Bolsheviks. They wanted to be like, oh, we're better than them, and whatnot.
Himmler specifically wrote that Hitler would not let them publicly leave the church for purely political reasons.
Yeah.
And so basically the real thing everyone in Germany had to do was swear allegiance to Hitler.
Yeah.
That was their true belief. And actually, Himmler believed that religiously, actually. Himmler was trying to build, and then you had Goebbels over here who came up with the Hyborian theory. You heard of Hyborian theory?
I think I've heard of it.
It's a crazy Nazi like ancient alien conspiracy theory.
I won't be surprised.
That essentially, like, the true supreme race are the Hyborians, and those are who the Germans are really descended from. And the Hyborians are actually extraterrestrial, and they of course are the true source of all knowledge and like development throughout human history, which is why Goebbels was the guy who went to Egypt to try and find evidence of aliens first.
Yeah, sounds about right.
And they believed that the Jews were a completely different alien race. That was
the German belief, their racial belief was that Jews are the most evil people ever. Below the Jews are my people, the Slavs. I might be Jewish as well, so I might be
okay. So Polish people are considered Slavs?
Yes, Poles are Slavs. And matter of fact, the Polish people, out of all the Slavs, because they hated all the Slavs, but they did have preferences of who they hated the most. Poles were on the bottom. They fucking hated them the most. I would say partly because Germans and Poles are right by each other, so there's like conflict there over centuries. So that's probably where that came from. But I mean, during Operation Barbarossa, and which coincide with General Plan Oust, which I don't know if you know what General Plan Oust is.
I have not heard that one.
Oh, you don't know? Oh, this is way more like batshit crazy and cruel. This was like a straight up hundreds of millions genocide campaign of Slavs. It was an ethnic cleansing and genocide campaign on Slavs and Eastern and Central and the Balkans, in which basically their plan was to, because they couldn't really murder all the Slavs by guns because it would just waste bullets. So they planned on starving the majority of the population to death. They started doing this when they invaded the Soviet Union and what have you, and there were other campaigns that they did. But the idea was to starve the majority of the population to death,
Okay.
and then enslave the rest.
This is very similar to what Britain did to Ireland.
Yep, and then there were some Slavs that the Nazis considered, particularly if you were a child and you had what they considered more Aryan characteristics. They kidnapped them, and then
this sounds familiar.
Yeah, with Russia, and Germanized them. And
that sounds exactly like what Russia's doing right now.
Basically what they're doing. And by the end of World War II, there were over 200,000 Polish children that were in Nazi captivity, and they thought they were German because they had features that the Nazis viewed as Germanic and Aryan, and not barbaric Slavs.
To bring it back to modern contemporary context right now, it's worth noting that when Russia talks about denazifying Ukraine,
it's projecting.
Well, yeah, that too.
Yeah.
But they also, it's worth noting that the country Russia does not use the same definition for Nazi that most people in the rest of the world use, because most people in the rest of the world, when we talk about Nazis, we are primarily talking about people who are both fascist and anti-Semitic. However, in Russia, the common held thought is that Nazi means anti-Slavic, and that is really the way they're trying to put it. Even though last time I checked, aren't Ukrainians a type of Slavic?
Yeah, they're Slavs are basically one giant ethno group, which includes Poles, Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Serbs, Croatians, Czechs, Slovaks. It's a lot. It's really like Slavs are the biggest ethno-linguistic group in Europeans compared to other Europeans. They're the largest, and our features are very noticeable. Like, as I said, Thomas is very fucking Slavic. You saw that on Facebook. He's very fucking Slavic. Like, it has to do with the noses, because I kind of do. I mean,
he also had a deviated septum and a broken nose, but yeah, no,
I would say like really the nose, like the nose shape, and also the ears. Like, if you ever like Google Slavs and just look, like, I'm like, these noses and the ears look very similar, which basically are features and whatnot. And one because I have to get going here soon. It's almost 8.
Yes.
Is that never call like, if I mean, it might not be a big of a deal unless there's somebody that's an immigrant here. They came from like a Slavic country in Eastern Europe. It might be very different if it's like generations go by and whatnot. But never go to immigrant that's Slavic, or go over Eastern Europe to a Slavic country and call one of them Russian or Ukrainian when they're not, or anything, because they will get very upset. Particularly like in current years right now, if you call Ukrainian Russian, they will get very upset with you. I
could imagine.
They would, like, I know somebody I work with, in which he used to work with a girl that was Ukrainian. She came from Ukraine. She had an accent and everything, and she would get very upset if you called her Russian. It's basically the same thing if you called a Chinese person Japanese. They would get very upset with you if you call them that.
Because they have long periods of time of ethnic conflict.
Yeah, same thing with Russians, Ukrainians, with the whole Holodomor thing.
Yeah.
And the Kakistan Holodomor.
I'm not familiar with that one.
Yeah, that's well, I can come over again another time.
I think there's a lot more to talk about here. So you should definitely come back sometime. We'll do a part 2. Just let me know when you're available.
Yeah.
And you have a YouTube channel, don't you?
Vaughn Wesley. It's just Vaughn Wesley, my legal last name, not my complicated Polish last name.
And from what I've seen, a lot of your videos are you talking about some of your favorite stand-up comedians.
Oh yeah, and like very notable comedians. If I'm ever going to do one about Cosby, I'm going to have to award it very differently, because I always have like a comedian's name and then one of the greatest comedians of all time. If I'm ever going to do a Cosby video, I'm going to have to word that very differently. I'm probably just going to be like Bill Cosby, the rise and the very bad fall.
I mean, in fairness to Cosby, he's one of these people who has his cultural impact leads to such a level of like complication, because like we now know that he was doing this terrible things
for decades.
Yeah, at the
since
same
like the 60s, I think.
At the same time, also, while ironically promoting this like in very sort of almost like borderline like very ethical Christian concept to the world, and at the same time also like did so much for his own community that they benefited from. So like it's a real gut punch to see to find out the things that are in the skeletons in Cosby's closet.
Yeah, and he's kind of like the John Chris Falusi of stand-up comedy. I don't know if you know who that is.
I do not know who that is.
Creator of Ren and Stimpy.
Oh wait, I do know who that is.
Mr. Groomer of underage girls. His 15-year-old girlfriend that he went to her 15-year-old birthday party and everything. He has that like very creepiness to him, and then he's just very like what during Ren and Stimpy when he was running the whole thing, he was just very abusive towards his underlings, his workers and whatnot. He was just very, very verbally abusive. He was very particular of how he wanted things. He was a perfectionist, so it really like to the worst level. And he was like, yeah, nobody has like really good things to say about him, particularly people that worked on Ren and Stimpy before he got fired, which is very something he has in common with Justin Roiland. They were voicing both. Well, with Roland, he voiced both characters. For Chris Falusi, he voiced only Ren, and then once he got fired, Billy West started voicing both of them. And Billy West initially auditioned for both characters, but because he was also working on Doug, he could only do one. Which was another Nickelodeon show, Doug. I'm sure you know of it.
Yeah, no.
You're 40 years old. You know these.
Hey, I'm not 40 yet. We're getting close.
Oh, I thought you were already.
No, I got like in April. April. So I got like, what is it? It's less than 6 months. Okay.
But you could say that Cosby is way worse than Chris Falusi. I mean, what he did was completely disgusting.
I mean, when you bring into the fact we're talking about like chemical abuse where you're drugging people, that is pretty horrific.
Yeah, I mean, as far as
I will say, like, if the allegations against what's his name, British guy, Russell Brand, if those accusations are true, then he is the most horrifying, to be completely honest.
Well,
you got grooming, and you have like straight up like hardcore assault.
Yeah, it seemed. Well, I wouldn't really be surprised with him, just like how he's like, "Oh, I'm a free thinker," and
now he's pivoted to Russian talking points.
Yeah, and that as well. Like with all because I don't know what's up with people that are pro Russia but also sexual deviants. Because there's a lot of them. Chris Ritter, I don't know if you know who that is.
I think I've heard of Chris Ritter.
He's a pro-Russian shill. He's American, but he's a pro-Russian shill. He used
Caleb Maupin again.
Yeah, he used to work in the UN as like a weapons specialist. And then what happened with him was that in 2001, he got arrested for basically trying to get in touch with a 15-year-old.
Have fun.
And then again with a 16-year-old in 2009. So he's a convicted pedophile. And matter of fact, back in August, RFK Jr. took a picture with him.
That's another person who like that. Once I really dug into RFK, there was a point where I was like, oh no, this man is just a weirdo piece of shit.
Yeah. Well, you want to end it there?
Sure, we can end it on RFK Jr.
Yeah.
being a
fuck that guy.
Check out Vaughn Wesley's YouTube. I'll put a link to it on the YouTube version. All right. Any last? Nice. Say goodbye.
Bye, guys. Take care.
All right. Thank you for listening. You can always like and subscribe wherever you're experiencing this podcast. And if you want to contact me, you can email me at rubenuncut@gmail.com. Have a wonderful whatever, wherever, whoever you are.